In the United Kingdom, the government is proposing and developing a new digital ID for its citizens, and this will be the ultimate system of surveillance and control. And in this video presentation, we take a look at where things stand, what is planned, and why you, as a sovereign being, would have nothing to fear when it comes to a digital ID. Greetings and welcome. My name is Russell Paul Arthur. I am an accredited practitioner of sovereign law and the creator of Grace Sovereignty Academy, an academy that helps people unwind from the bondage, detriments, and liabilities of citizenship. An academy that teaches people how to implement lawful procedures to restore sovereign status and standing, where people like yourself can safeguard their value and rights from the legalized mechanisms of control and extortion that comes with citizenship. And today I will open the lid on a new state-imposed mechanism of control, the digital ID. Right now, the UK government is not only proposing, they are also developing a new digital ID system that is designed to contain all your identifications, capture all of your digital data, and create a digital profile and footprint of your life, where the government owns and controls a digital version of your life. Right now, the UK government is already building a digital wallet app so that people can store digital versions of their government-issued documents, such as a driver's license, passport, national insurance, and proof of age. And in this digital wallet app, they also include the data for DBS checks, which means disclosure and barring checks, so that public authorities can access your digital ID to do background checks on you, to do profiling and compliance checks, before they decide if you can access their public services. The digital ID is being created as a tool of verification so that you can access and use public services that are going online, that are being digitized. Now, the UK government had previously stated that they were not planning to introduce a compulsory national digital ID. But now the current Prime Minister is stating that they will be mandatory, where you must have the digital ID or you will not be able to work. Now, on the surface level, these digital IDs are being promoted by government officials as a way to modernize public services, as a way to give more convenience to the citizens by speeding up the process of ID verification and to prevent illegal immigration and work. And as with all things in this world, there are pros and cons. There will be the upsides and the downside of having and using a digital ID. However, one thing must be acknowledged, and that is the government functions with one ultimate agenda. And that ultimate agenda is to control and extort the lives of the citizens, because people are now conducting more and more of their personal and business lives online in a digital space. And because more and more public services are going online, the government needs a way to dominate and regulate the activities of its citizens online. With this new digital ID system, where a citizen can only access online services through the verification of a digital ID, from that entry point of verification, as you go online to use different public services, the government can track and trace your movements and actions by collecting and storing your digital data. The government can record and store your digital data in one centralized and streamlined place. The government has the ultimate system of surveillance and control, where those who operate the system can keep a track and score, can review, monitor and measure your digital data as you conduct your life, where your rights to privacy, your natural and inherent rights to live a private life that is free from intrusions, have been lost. The same applies to your freedoms of choice, your freedoms of movement. They too will be lost. That's because the digital ID and data that creates a digital version of you is linked to the real you. The digital you is overseen and controlled by government agencies. These government agencies will be utilising sophisticated algorithms and AI technology to monitor and measure your behaviour. They will be able to detect if you have violated any public policies and codes. These digital agencies could have the authority and power to act as judge and jury to determine and decide if you have trespassed against the law. Well, they could decide to penalise and punish you by issuing fines, by limiting and restricting your access to public services. Doing so without a due process of law. Doing so at the click of a button, where you are immediately locked out of the system and unable to conduct your life. And this should be a real concern for you, because in different parts of the world, digital ID systems are being utilized as part of a social credit system. And this is happening in China right now, where a digital ID is mandatory for Chinese citizens who are locked into a social crediting system. The citizens in China are credited or discredited in accordance with how much they do or do not conform with state-imposed rules and regulations, where the citizens in China are penalised and punished when they violate rules and regulations. And there are hundreds of thousands of Chinese citizens who are locked out and restricted from certain parts of society, who cannot access public transport, cannot travel to faraway destinations, and cannot access specific public services that they do need to facilitate their life. And within this social crediting system, they have a total loss of freedoms. They live in a digital dictatorship, where a bad social credit score, where not conforming to the dictates of government, means your ability to function and live is severely restricted and limited. And don't just take my word on this. Have a look online. You will find many documentaries that highlights the impact of this social crediting system that is happening in China right now and that could happen in the UK as part of the new digital ID system. Now think about how a social crediting system would affect you. Imagine you have a digital ID that is monitoring and recording your actions. Imagine government agencies are tracking and taxing your carbon footprint, for example, which they already plan to do. Imagine there is a government agency with the authority to determine and decide when you have consumed too much product, created too much waste, driven too far, or travelled abroad too much, where you have violated the rules and regulations attached to carbon emissions. This government agency might decide to limit your freedoms by placing restrictions on your digital ID that limits how much you can consume, limits how far you can drive, and limits how many times you can travel abroad. They might impose carbon taxes, fees, or penalties, where you are penalised for having too much freedom, or where you must pay if you want more freedom. With your access and use of public services attached to a digital ID system, all a government agency needs to do is change the settings on your digital ID to restrict and limit the access that you can have to public services, where at the click of a button, they can lock you out from certain aspects of society. Then we have the government's much publicised agenda of creating a system known as the Internet of Things. There is a planned agenda for all citizens to be hooked up with implantable and wearable technology in order to access the internet, where your biometrics can be scanned, measured and assessed using 5G Wi-Fi technology, where your health status is constantly monitored and measured, and where this digital data will also be collected and used as part of your digital ID and profile. And listen, this digital ID system is being planned by most governments worldwide who are part of the United Nations, who are part of a treaty of one world governance, as they work together in lockstep collusion and forging ahead with a digital ID system. And we can already see this digital ID system being rolled out internationally. At the border control and immigration of many countries, biometric scanning and verification systems are already being installed, where the biometric data of your eyes and fingerprints are being recorded as you travel. Governments worldwide have already spent billions on digital track and trace apps. Governments worldwide are proposing and drafting legislated bills and policies to bring forth and develop the digital ID system for widespread public use. If you care to do any research, the UK government has already enacted the Data Bill Act 2025, where the government is creating a framework of law that enables public service providers to share your data for verification purposes. There is a Data Protection and Digital Information Bill that covers on how your biometric data can and cannot be used, and high-level government officials are proposing the so-called BRIC card. And like I said before, this should be a real concern for you, because this digital ID, once it has become legislated into law and compulsory to have and use, this will have a major impact on your life. This digital ID will be a complete desecration of your natural freedoms and rights. This digital ID means your life will be placed into the ultimate system of surveillance and control. And sadly, because we live in a system of top-down control, where those in governments and authority impose rules over the people, these digital IDs being proposed and developed by the UK government, they are outside of our control. We have no control over when and how they will arrive. That said, yes, we can protest, we can sign petitions, we can say no and not consent. However, regardless of all that, if the government wants a digital ID rolled out across the nation, it will make it happen. It will go against the will of the people, because ultimately the government is serving other interests, and where the agenda is to create the ultimate system of surveillance and control. So what can we actually do about this? What practical measures can we take to counteract any negative impacts that this digital ID could have upon our lives? How do we accept and use a digital ID for the purpose of accessing public services without being subject to any of the detriments and liabilities that come with a digital ID? How can we use a digital ID while still retaining our freedoms and rights, while still maintaining privacy? The answer to all those questions is with sovereignty. Because when you achieve sovereign status and standing in this world, you will be able to claim and take authority and control over a digital ID. And right now I will explain why and how that works, and where you shall learn about lawful procedures that secures and protects your freedoms, rights and privacy. So do stay tuned. I begin with this opening statement. Right now you are registered as a citizen of the state, but you are not a citizen. You only act as a citizen. That is because a citizen is a character of law. The word citizen is a title and name that legally defines the status and standing of a corporate legal entity that operates in the public domain under the authority and control of the state. The citizen is a corporate legal entity that is owned and controlled by the state. Now, obviously, you are not a citizen. You are not a corporate legal entity. You are not a character of law. You are a living and breathing man or woman. However, the government is able to assert authority and control over you as a living man or woman because you and your life is a bonded surety for the citizen. This means you have accepted responsibility and liability for the citizen. And you do this each and every time that you register, identify and act as the citizen in the public domain. Now here is where it gets interesting. When the nation state issues you a public identification, you become the registered and licensed holder of that public identification. This means you are not the owner of the identification, you are the holder, simply because the identification was created and issued by the state and is public property that is held within a public trust that is controlled by the state. So for example, you have a passport, but you do not own the passport. The passport is not yours. The passport is not your property to own. The passport is public property. As a citizen and trustee of the nation state, you have been granted the rights. You are entrusted with a duty to hold, possess and use the public identification. In the UK, you are a British passport holder. You hold the passport as a subject of the Crown and a citizen of the state, where you hold public property that belongs to the Crown and state, where you are a trustee in a trust arrangement with the Crown and state to hold and use that public property. And this trust arrangement is known as an implied trust. This means the trust is not a written or spoken agreement, but is an inferred agreement based upon the circumstances of you holding public property for and on behalf of a public trust. Now, in accordance with trust law, a trustee is the one that holds all the legal responsibilities and liabilities for managing any property that is held within a trust arrangement. So this means when it comes to a digital ID, if you obtain a digital ID, a trust arrangement is formed between you and the state, where that trust will have terms that dictates your obligations and usage of the digital ID, where you as a trustee will become personally responsible for all the liabilities attached to the obligations and use of the ID. You will be liable for all the rules, regulations, debts, damages, penalties, fees and anything else the state imposes as the terms that apply to you holding and using the digital ID. A digital ID that has been designed to control and extort your life. But this all changes. This all changes when you change your lawful status and standing in relation to the nation state. This all changes when you unwind from citizenship and become sovereign, where you can exercise your natural freedoms and rights to sever and separate your actual life as a living man or woman from the corporate legal entity known as the citizen, where you are no longer acting as a bonded surety for the citizen, where you are no longer in corporate legal bondage with the Crown and state, where the Crown and state no longer has the authority and right to control or extort your life, because no authority in this world can ever own, control or extort your life against your free will choice without your voluntary consent, as this would be the definition of slavery. This would be a criminal act. When you achieve sovereignty, you gain freedom and independence from the Crown and state. You gain freedom and independence from the corporate legal entity known as the citizen, where you, as a sovereign, can then claim and control the citizen, including the digital ID. And here is how it works. When you achieve sovereign status and standing, you can enact lawful procedures in accordance with trust law, contract law, and the law of equity to claim all the equitable interests that you rightfully own in the name of the citizen. Because right now, all the equity and rights of your life and livelihood, everything that you own, hold, build and earn within the public domain of the nation state, you do so in the name of the citizen, where your entire worth is wrapped up in a corporate legal entity that is contained in a public trust that is owned and controlled by the Crown and state. And remember, you are not the citizen. You are not a corporate legal entity. You are a living man or woman. As the living man or woman, you are the one who has done all the work. You are the one who has built all the worth that is registered in the name of the citizen. You can therefore utilise the law of equity to claim and take control of all the equitable interests that you as a living man or woman have vested in the citizen, that rightfully belongs to you as a living man or woman. Once you have claimed your interests in the citizen, you can then secure them in a unique private trust arrangement that exists in a private and sovereign venue and jurisdiction, where you as a sovereign effectively and lawfully remove the interests of the citizen outside of the authority and control of the nation state, government and its public domain. This also means you can do the same with a digital ID, because the digital ID would be an interest of the citizen. As a sovereign, you can claim all the equity and rights of the digital ID, including the digital data that rightfully belongs to you as a living man or woman. And this means rather than accept the digital ID as a citizen, rather than be a holder of public property, you would instead accept the digital ID as a sovereign man or woman, and you would accept the digital ID as a gift in equity, where you can treat the issuance and receiving of the digital ID as a gift from the nation state, where you can secure the digital ID and data into a unique private trust arrangement. Once you do this, the digital ID and data will become private property that is owned and held within a private trust that you control in the private. By restructuring and converting your interests in the digital ID into a private trust arrangement with terms and conditions that are favourable to your use of the digital ID and this data, you can still use the ID for verification purposes in the public to gain access and use of public services to facilitate your life, and yet the equity and rights that you have in the digital ID and its data are secured within the special terms of a private trust arrangement. They are protected from any and all detriments and liabilities that may arise from public agencies within the public domain. That is because once the digital ID and data is secured in a private trust arrangement, it is protected by trust law and private contract law, where it is a serious crime with serious consequences for anyone, for any third party, for any public agency that is not part of the private trust arrangement, that does not have expressed permission from the private trust. It is unlawful and criminal for them to collect, store, hold, possess, appropriate or use the digital ID and data that is private property that belongs to a private trust. This means it would be unlawful and illegal for any public agency or authority that is involved in the issuance and regulation of the digital ID and data, that is involved in your access and use of the digital ID and data, to use that digital ID and data in any way that violates the terms and conditions of the new private trust. To use the digital ID and data in any way where the private trust has not given the public agency or authorities authorised permission to use the digital ID and data, where that public agency or authority can be held accountable in a court of law for the unauthorised use, misuse, abuse and misappropriation of your digital ID and data. Once the digital ID and data is secured in a private trust arrangement, they must not violate any privacy and confidentiality terms attached to the storage and use of the digital data that is now private property of a private trust controlled by you in the private. If they do violate the terms, if they do misappropriate the trust property, these agencies and authorities must cease and desist any actions that go against and violates the terms and conditions of the private trust. And you can demand that they return the private property back to its original quality, or they will face the consequences that they themselves have created. That is because in this new private trust arrangement that secures your interests in the digital ID and data as private property of a private trust, you would appoint the public agency that issues the digital ID and stores the digital data as the trustees of the new private trust. In accordance with trust law, the trustees are those who hold the legal title to any trust property. And this means the public agencies that issue and store the digital ID and data, they would be entrusted as trustees to handle and settle all legal matters in relation to your use of the digital ID. The public trustees would have the legal responsibility and liability to settle and neutralise any charges, penalties, restrictions and limitations that they themselves or any other public service providers create and attach to your use of the digital ID. Furthermore, once you have secured the digital ID and data in a private trust, you as a sovereign will be positioned as the living beneficiary of that trust, where you as the living beneficiary are recognised in the law of equity as being the true owner of the trust property. The trust property being the digital ID and data. In this new private trust arrangement, you have restructured the owner's rights of the digital ID and data. You have restructured the authority and control over the digital ID and data. You have removed the digital ID and data from the venue and jurisdiction of the Crown, State and its public domain, where a private trust owns and controls the digital ID and data in a new private and sovereign venue and jurisdiction. In this new private trust arrangement, you have effectively and lawfully reversed the situation. You have turned the tables. You have repositioned your interests. You have taken authority and control over the digital ID and its data, doing so in accordance with the highest laws of the land, trust law, contract law and the law of equity, where this new private trust arrangement is what prevents any public agency that is involved in your use of digital ID, prevents them from having absolute authority and control over your life, where they can be held accountable and liable for the misuse or abuse of your digital ID and data. And this is what we do. What I've just shown you is exactly what we teach at Grace Sovereignty Academy. We teach, guide and support our private members the knowledge, skills and lawful procedures on how to achieve sovereignty, how to claim the interests of the citizen, how to protect the freedoms, rights and privacy of their lives from the detriments and liabilities of a nation state, government and its public domain that functions on the sole premise of control and extortion. And that brings me to a close. If this presentation has sparked an interest in you to learn more about sovereignty, if you want to know more about what we are doing inside our academy to protect our lives from corporatized and legalized corruption and tyranny, if you want to know how you can utilize lawful procedures to protect your life and estate, to rise above and move beyond a world that seeks to limit and restrict you, then I invite you to register for a 60-day trial of our academy so that you can see for yourself if what we are doing is the right course of action for the next stage of your life. Thanks for being here. Take care.